Have you ever wondered if everything you believed about God was completely wrong? Marcus Chen thought he knew the truth about faith, about the divine, about his place in the universe. But on a cold November night in rural Montana, something descended from the darkness that would shatter every religious conviction he'd ever held. What began as a routine evening checking on his cattle became the most terrifying and enlightening experience of his life. The being that emerged from that come impossible craft didn't with violence or threats. Instead, it delivered a message so profound, so disturbing, that Marcus would never see reality the same way again. This is his story, and what happened next will challenge everything you think you know about God, faith, and humanity's true purpose. The silence in rural Montana can be overwhelming. It's the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, where every small emptiness. Marcus Chen, sound becomes amplified in the vast, had grown accustomed to this solitude over the past 5 years since inheriting his grandfather's ranch. At 34, he'd left behind a successful career in software engineering to embrace a simpler life among the rolling hills, and endless he hadn't expected was how skies of big sky country. But the isolation would force him to confront questions he'd been avoiding his entire adult life. Marcus had been raised Methodist, confirmed at 13, and attended church regularly through college. His faith had been comfortable, predictable, something that provided structure without demanding too much examination. But out here, under everything, if stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, he found himself questioning God created this vast universe. Why did Earth seem so small and insignificant? If divine love was infinite, why did suffering persist? These weren't new questions, but the silence gave them weight, urgency, a presence that demanded answers. On this particular November evening, Marcus was making his final rounds before bed. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and he needed to ensure the cattle had adequate shelter and water. His breath formed clouds in the crisp air as he walked between the enclosures, checking each gate, counting heads, listening for any signs of distress. The routine was meditative, almost prayerful, a way of ending each day with purposeful action. The first sign that something was different came as a low humming sound, barely audible at first. Marcus paused, tilting his head to listen. It wasn't mechanical like a distant airplane or truck. The frequency was deeper, more resonant, like the bass note of some cosmic instrument. He looked up at the clear night sky, searching for aircraft lights, but saw only the familiar constellations he'd learned to identify during his years on the ranch. The humming grew louder, and Marcus felt it more than heard it, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground beneath his feet and the air around him. The cattle began to shift restlessly, lowing softly and clustering together in the center of their enclosure. Their behavior triggered something PR and ancient timal in Marcus, warning system that told him to seek shelter, to hide, to run. But curiosity held him in place, even as every rational thought screamed that he should retreat to the safety of his farmhouse. That's when he saw the lights. They appeared first as a faint glow on the horizon, moving too slowly to be aircraft, too deliberately to be natural phenomena. As they drew closer, Marcus could see that the lights were arranged in a perfect triangular formation, pulsing with colors that shifted from deep blue to brilliant white to an otherworldly green that had no earthly equivalent. The craft itself became visible as a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky, massive and silent except for that persistent humming that now filled the air completely. Marcus stood transfixed as the object descended toward his pasture, moving with a fluid grace that defied everything he understood about physics and aviation. There was no downdraft from rotors, no exhaust flames from engines, no sound of turbines or propellers. It simply lowered itself with the gentle certainty of something completely in control of forces beyond human comprehension. The cattle had fallen completely silent now, standing motionless as if frozen by some invisible command. The craft settled approximately 50 yards from where Marcus stood, hovering just a few feet above the ground. Up close, its size was even more impressive, easily the length of a football field and perhaps half as wide. The surface appeared to be made of some material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, creating the unsettling impression that he was looking at a hole in reality itself. The pulsing lights continued their hypnotic dance along what he assumed were the edges of the vessel, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. Marcus knew he should run. Every instinct told him to flee back to the house, lock the doors, call the authorities, pretend this wasn't happening. Instead, he found himself taking a step forward, then another. Something about the presence of the craft felt less threatening than he'd expected. There was an intelligence there, a consciousness that seemed to be observing him with the same curiosity he felt toward it. The humming had evolved into something almost musical, a complex harmony of tones that created patterns in his mind, images and emotions that weren't quite his own. A section of the craft's surface began to glow more brightly, and Marcus realized he was witnessing the opening of some kind of portal or doorway. The light intensified, but rather than hurting his eyes, it seemed to adjust itself to a level he could comfortably observe. From within that radiance, a figure began to emerge. It wasn't the stereotypical gray alien of popular culture, nor the monstrous creature of science fiction films. Instead, the being that stepped onto his pasture appeared almost human, tall and graceful with features that were familiar, yet subtly different, as if someone had taken human anatomy and refined it according to principles Marcus couldn't identify. The being wore no visible clothing, yet its skin seemed to shimmer with an inner light that provided both modesty and an otherworldly beauty. Its eyes were larger than human eyes, a deep blue that contained depths Marcus felt he could fall into. When it looked at him, he experienced a sensation he'd never felt before, as if every thought, every memory, every secret fear and hidden dream was being gently examined by a consciousness far more vast and ancient than his own. Without opening its mouth, the being spoke to him. The words formed directly in his mind, bypassing his ears entirely, arriving as pure meaning wrapped in a voice that was neither male nor female, but somehow both and neither. The tone was gentle, patient, filled with a compassion that brought unexpected tears to Marcus's eyes. "Do not be afraid, Marcus," the voice said. "I have traveled far to speak with you, and there is much we must discuss. Your species stands at a crossroads, and the beliefs you hold about the divine are preventing you from taking the next step in your evolution. What you call God is not what you think it is, and the time has come for you to understand the truth." Marcus tried to respond but found his voice had abandoned him. His mouth moved soundlessly as his mind struggled to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. People didn't have conversations with alien beings in Montana pastures. These things happened in movies, in books, in the testimony of people dismissed as delusional or attention-seeking. Yet here he stood, fully awake and aware, experiencing something that challenged every assumption about reality he'd ever held. "I know this is difficult," the being continued, and Marcus sensed genuine empathy in those words. "Your mind is trying to categorize this experience, to find a framework that allows you to maintain your existing worldview. But I ask you to set aside those limitations for now. Listen with your heart rather than your intellect. Feel the truth of what I'm about to share, rather than analyzing it with the tools your limited education has provided." The being moved closer, and Marcus felt a wave of energy wash over him. It wasn't threatening or invasive, but rather like being embraced by something infinite and loving. His fear began to dissipate, replaced by a profound sense of peace and an inexplicable knowing that he was in the presence of something genuinely benevolent. Your religions speak of God as a singular entity, a supreme being who created everything and watches over his creation from a distant throne, the being explained. This understanding is both true and completely inadequate. What you call God is indeed the source of all creation, but not in the way your limited perspectives have imagined. The divine consciousness that permeates all existence is not separate from creation but is creation itself, experiencing reality through countless forms across infinite dimensions. Marcus felt his worldview beginning to crack and shift. Everything he'd been taught about God suddenly seemed small and provincial, like describing the ocean by examining a single drop of water. But that's only the beginning, the being continued. Your species has been guided throughout its development by beings like myself, representatives of civilizations that achieved unity with the divine consciousness eons ago. What your ancestors interpreted as angels, gods, and divine messengers were often visitors from other worlds, sharing knowledge and wisdom to help humanity evolve. The problem is that your religious leaders have distorted these teachings, creating systems of control rather than pathways to enlightenment. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. If what this being was telling him was true, then every prayer he'd ever offered, every sermon he'd heard, every moment of faith and doubt and spiritual seeking had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. The God he'd worshipped was real, but infinitely more vast and immediate than he'd ever imagined. And humanity had been receiving guidance from advanced civilizations for millennia. Guidance that had been twisted into dogma and ritual that actually separated people from the divine truth they sought. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus finally managed to whisper, his voice hoarse with emotion. The being's expression shifted to something Marcus interpreted as sadness mixed with hope. "Because your species is approaching a critical juncture. The consciousness that created everything is preparing for a new phase of universal evolution, one that will require humanity to abandon its primitive understanding of separation and embrace its role as part of a vast, interconnected, cosmic community. Those who can accept this truth will participate in a transformation beyond your current imagination. Those who cannot will remain trapped in cycles of conflict and limitation." Marcus looked around at his simple ranch, at the cattle standing motionless in the starlight, at the familiar landscape that now seemed like a stage set for something far more significant than he'd ever realized. His life, which had felt so ordinary just hours ago, had become the focal point of a cosmic drama playing out across space and time. "What happens now?" he asked, though part of him wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. The being smiled, and in that expression Marcus glimpsed something of the infinite love that underlies all existence. "Now you begin to remember who you really are." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning two completely different realities. Marcus felt something stirring deep within his chest, a recognition that seemed to come from somewhere beyond memory, beyond conscious thought. It was as if the being's presence had activated dormant circuits in his mind, awakening capacities he'd never known he possessed. "Remember?" Marcus repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't understand what you mean." The being moved even closer, and Marcus could see that its skin wasn't truly solid, but seemed to be composed of light itself, shifting and flowing like liquid starlight. When it spoke again, the words carried layers of meaning that unfolded in his consciousness like flowers blooming in fast motion. "Every soul that incarnates on Earth carries within it the memory of its true origin," the being explained. "You are not merely Marcus Chen, rancher from Montana. You are an eternal consciousness that chose to experience human existence as part of your cosmic education. The isolation you've felt, the questions that have haunted you, the sense that something fundamental was missing from your life, all of these are symptoms of your soul attempting to reconnect with its larger purpose. Marcus felt his knees go weak. The implications of what he was hearing seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, reshaping everything he thought he knew about identity, purpose, mortality. If this was true, then death wasn't an ending but a transition. Life wasn't random but purposeful, and the loneliness he'd experienced wasn't abandonment but a call to awakening. "But why me?" he asked, gesturing helplessly at himself. "I'm nobody special. I write code, I tend cattle, I live alone on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. If you're looking for someone to share this information with the world, surely there are better candidates. Religious leaders, scientists, people with influence and credibility." The being's expression shifted to what Marcus interpreted as gentle amusement. "Do you think we choose our messengers based on earthly credentials? The religious leaders you mention are often the most invested in maintaining systems that obscure truth rather than revealing it. The scientists are bound by paradigms that cannot accommodate realities beyond physical measurement. We seek those whose hearts are open, whose minds haven't been completely colonized by limiting beliefs, whose souls are ready to expand beyond the boundaries of conventional thinking." Marcus thought about his years of questioning, his growing dissatisfaction with traditional religious answers, his sense that there had to be something more to existence than what he'd been taught. Perhaps his isolation hadn't been a punishment or a way of clearing away a mistake, but a preparation. The noise so he could hear when truth finally spoke. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he said, though part of him was terrified of the answer. "For now, nothing more than listen and integrate what you're learning," the being replied. "The transformation I spoke of cannot be forced or rushed. It must unfold organically, beginning with individuals who are ready to embrace expanded consciousness and rippling outward through human society. You are one of many who will receive this information, each according to their capacity and circumstances." The being gestured toward the craft behind it, and Marcus noticed that the lights had shifted to a softer, more welcoming glow. "Would you like to see more?" To understand more fully what your species is being offered, every rational part of Marcus's mind screamed warnings. This was how people disappeared, how ordinary lives became cautionary tales about the dangers of believing in impossible things. But a deeper part of him, a part that had been waiting his entire life for this moment, whispered that this was exactly what he'd been searching for without knowing it. "Will I come back?" he asked, surprised by his own willingness to consider such an incredible possibility. "You will return when you choose to return," the being assured him. "Time operates differently beyond your current understanding. What might feel like hours to you could be moments here, or vice versa. But you will come back changed, carrying knowledge that will reshape not only your own existence but potentially the existence of many others." Marcus looked around one more time at the familiar landscape of his ranch. The cattle remained motionless, as if time itself had paused to allow this impossible conversation to unfold. The stars seemed brighter now, more alive, as if they were witnessing something significant. He realized that regardless of what he chose, his life had already been irrevocably altered. He could never go back to seeing reality the way he had just hours ago. "There's something else you should understand," the being continued, sensing his internal struggle. "What your religious traditions call revelation has always worked this way. The prophets and mystics throughout human history weren't special because they were chosen by a distant deity. They were individuals who had developed the capacity to perceive and communicate with the broader consciousness that permeates all existence. They were contactees, though they didn't have that word for their experiences. This reframing sent another shockwave through Marcus's worldview. Moses receiving the 10 Commandments, Muhammad's encounter with the angel Gabriel, Paul's vision on the road to Damascus, all the foundational moments of human religious experience suddenly took on new dimensions. What if these hadn't been supernatural interventions by an otherworldly God, but contacts with advanced beings committed to humanity's spiritual evolution? The beings you call angels, the being continued, apparently reading his thoughts, are often representatives of civilizations that achieved unity with divine consciousness long ago. We serve as bridges between your current level of understanding and the vastly expanded awareness that awaits your species. The messages we bring aren't in stone and meant to be carved worshipped as final truth, but understood as waypoints on an infinite journey of discovery. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face, though he couldn't say exactly why he was crying. It wasn't fear or sadness, but something deeper, a profound recognition of how small and limited his previous understanding had been, coupled with overwhelming gratitude for the vastness that was being revealed. "The God you've been taught to worship," the being said gently, "is real, but infinitely more intimate and immediate than your religions suggest. The divine consciousness doesn't watch you from a distant heaven, but experiences existence through you, as you, in every moment. When you feel love, the universe feels love through your heart. When you create beauty, the cosmos creates beauty through your hands. When you seek truth, divine intelligence seeks truth through your mind." The implications were staggering. If this was accurate, then prayer wasn't petitioning a separate entity for favors, but aligning with the deepest currents of reality itself. Worship wasn't about appeasing a demanding deity, but celebrating the miracle of consciousness, exploring its own infinite nature. Sin wasn't disobedience to arbitrary rules, but actions that disconnected individuals from their divine essence. "But why has this truth been hidden?" Marcus asked. "Why have religious institutions taught something so different?" The being's expression grew somber. Some distortion was inevitable, as profound spiritual insights were filtered through limited human understanding and translated across cultures and centuries. But much of the obscuration was deliberate, created by those who discovered that frightened, separated, guilty people are easier to control than empowered, connected, joyful ones. Fear-based religion serves earthly power structures far better than love-based spirituality. Marcus thought about the churches of his youth, the emphasis on sin and judgment, the way faith had been presented as belief in unprovable doctrines rather than direct experience of transcendent reality. How much human potential had been wasted, how much joy sacrificed, how much wisdom ignored in service of systems designed to manage populations rather than liberate souls. "The time of deliberate ignorance is ending," the being announced. "Your species has reached a level of technological development that makes continued isolation from galactic civilization impossible. The choice now is whether humanity will join the cosmic community as conscious participants or be overwhelmed by realities it refuses to acknowledge. This is why we're making contact more directly now, why the veil between dimensions is thinning, why more and more of your people are having experiences that don't fit within conventional worldviews." Marcus realized that his encounter wasn't unique, but part of a larger pattern, a systematic effort to prepare humanity for transformation on a scale he could barely imagine. Somewhere around the world, others were having similar conversations, receiving similar revelations, being invited to expand beyond the limitations that had defined human existence for millennia. "Are you ready?" the being asked, extending what might have been a hand toward the glowing portal of the craft. Marcus Chen, software engineer turned rancher, Methodist turned seeker, human being on the verge of discovering what that identity truly meant, took a deep breath and stepped toward the light that would change everything. As Marcus approached the craft, the air around him seemed to thicken with energy. Each step felt like moving through liquid light, his body becoming lighter and more translucent with every inch forward. The being walked beside him, its presence both alien and familiar, like encountering a long-lost friend whose face had been forgotten, but whose essence remained recognizable in the deepest chambers of memory. The portal expanded as they drew near, revealing an interior that defied every expectation Marcus had formed about spacecraft design. There were no metal corridors or blinking control panels, no sterile surfaces or mechanical components. Instead, he found himself entering what could only be described as a living space, walls that pulsed gently with organic rhythms, surfaces that responded to touch with warm luminescence, an environment that felt more grown than constructed. "Your technology assumes separation between user and tool," the being explained, as Marcus stared in wonder at his surroundings. "Advanced civilizations learn to create through consciousness itself. This vessel responds to intention rather than manipulation, powered by harmony rather than combustion. It is less a machine than an extension of those who guide it." Marcus reached out to touch what appeared to be a wall, only to have his hand pass through the surface as if it were made of solidified light. The sensation was neither warm nor cold, but something entirely outside his previous sensory experience, like touching pure possibility itself. As his fingers made contact, images flooded his mind, visions of worlds so beautiful they brought fresh tears to his eyes. He saw cities that grew like forests, their spires reaching toward alien skies, while their roots extended deep into crystalline earth. He witnessed beings of pure energy dancing through dimensions that existed parallel to physical reality, their movements creating symphonies of color and sound that served as both art and communication. He observed civilizations that had learned to transform entire star systems into gardens of consciousness, where each planet served a unique purpose in the cosmic education of souls, seeking to understand their infinite nature. "This is what awaits your species," the being said, and Marcus realized the visions weren't random, but carefully chosen glimpses of humanity's potential future. Not as conquerors or consumers, but as gardeners of consciousness, cultivators of beauty, explorers of the deepest mysteries of existence. But first, you must release the illusion of separation that has kept you trapped in cycles of conflict and scarcity. They moved deeper into the vessel, passing through chambers that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Marcus found he could perceive layers of reality he'd never imagined, spaces that contained other spaces, geometries that folded back on themselves in impossible ways. His mind, stretched beyond its normal limits, began to adapt to these expanded possibilities with surprising ease. "Your brain is more flexible than you realize," the being observed, apparently monitoring his adaptation process. "Human consciousness is designed to interface with multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The limitations you experience are learned, not inherent. Children often perceive these expanded dimensions naturally until education trains them to focus only on the physical realm." They entered what Marcus could only think of as a viewing chamber, though the walls displayed not images but direct experience. Suddenly, he was standing on countless worlds, witnessing the rise and fall of civilizations across vast stretches of time, observing the eternal dance of creation and dissolution that characterized existence at every scale. Yet, rather than feeling overwhelmed by the immensity of what he was experiencing, he found himself filled with profound peace. Scale is an illusion, the being explained. The consciousness that animates a single cell is the same consciousness that guides entire galaxies. The love you feel for another person is the same love that holds universes together. Your personal journey of awakening is simultaneously the universe coming to know itself more fully. Nothing is separate, nothing is insignificant, nothing is without purpose. Marcus watched civilizations that had learned to transcend physical death entirely, their members choosing when and how to incarnate based on what experiences would best serve their continuing evolution. He saw worlds where the boundary between individual and collective consciousness had become fluid, allowing beings to share experiences, memories, and insights as easily as humans shared conversation. He witnessed the birth of new dimensions of reality, created through the focused intention of advanced civilizations working in harmony with the fundamental creative forces of existence. But what about suffering? Marcus asked, thinking of all the pain and struggle he'd witnessed throughout his life. If consciousness is truly unified, if there's purpose to everything, why do beings experience such agony? The being's expression shifted to one of profound compassion. Suffering arises from the illusion of separation, from forgetting one's true nature as an expression of infinite consciousness. It serves as a catalyst, driving souls to seek reunion with their source. Every moment of pain contains within it the seeds of greater understanding. Every loss creates space for deeper love. Every crisis offers opportunities for transcendence that wouldn't exist otherwise. Marcus found himself viewing his own life from this expanded perspective. His parents' divorce when he was 12, the loneliness that had driven him to seek solitude on the ranch, the deaths of loved ones that had left him questioning the meaning of existence, all of it suddenly took on new significance. Rather than random tragedies or personal failures, he could see them as carefully orchestrated experiences designed to crack open his heart and mind, preparing him for this moment of revelation. Even your religious upbringing served this purpose, the being continued. The limitations and contradictions you encountered in traditional faith weren't obstacles to overcome, but stepping stones leading you toward direct experience of truth. Every question that organized religion couldn't answer was an invitation to seek more authentic understanding. They moved to another section of the vessel where Marcus encountered something that challenged his understanding even more fundamentally. Here, he met other humans, people from different time periods and cultures who had received similar contact throughout history. A woman in ancient robes who spoke of visions that had inspired her to establish mystery schools in Egypt. A medieval monk whose mystical experiences had been dismissed as heresy by church authorities. A Native American shaman whose communications with star beings had guided his tribe's spiritual practices for generations. Contact has always been occurring, the being explained as Marcus conversed telepathically with these individuals from across time. What you call miracles, prophecies, divine revelations, artistic inspiration, scientific breakthroughs, many of these represent moments when human consciousness has expanded enough to receive transmissions from more advanced civilizations. The process is accelerating now because your species is approaching a collective threshold. Marcus spoke with a physicist from the early 20th century whose contact experience had inspired theories that wouldn't be accepted by mainstream science for decades. He communed with artists whose otherworldly encounters had produced works of transcendent beauty that had uplifted human consciousness for centuries. He shared insights with contemporary contactees from around the globe, each carrying pieces of a vast puzzle that was slowly revealing itself to humanity. We are not the first to receive this information, Marcus realized, his understanding expanding with each interaction. This has been happening throughout human history, preparing us gradually for something unprecedented. Exactly, the being confirmed. Your species is approaching what we call a consciousness convergence, a moment when enough individuals have awakened to their true nature that collective transformation becomes inevitable. This has happened with countless civilizations throughout the universe. Those that successfully navigate this transition join the galactic community as conscious participants in cosmic evolution. Those that resist or fail to achieve the necessary level of unity typically destroy themselves before reaching technological maturity. The implications were both terrifying and exhilarating. Humanity stood at a crossroads where the choices made by current generations would determine not just their own future, but whether the human race would survive experiment would continue at all. The nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and social divisions that characterized contemporary Earth weren't separate problems, but symptoms of a species struggling with the growing pains of cosmic adolescence. The signs are everywhere for those who know how to interpret them, the being continued. Increasing numbers of people reporting contact experiences, growing awareness of consciousness as fundamental rather than emergent, the breakdown of traditional institutions that no longer serve human evolution, the emergence of technologies that mirror abilities your species will develop naturally once you embrace your true nature. Marcus found himself in what could only be described as a council chamber, though the beings present existed in forms so varied that human language had no adequate terms for their diversity. Some appeared humanoid like his guide, others were geometric patterns of living light. Still others communicated through frequencies that bypassed physical form entirely. Yet all radiated the same essential quality of awakened consciousness, the same profound love and wisdom that his guide embodied. You are witnessing a gathering of representatives from civilizations throughout this region of the galaxy, his guide explained. We convene regularly to coordinate our assistance to developing worlds like Earth. Each species contributes unique perspectives based on their own evolutionary journey, their own discoveries about the nature of consciousness and reality. Marcus listened as these beings discussed humanity's progress with the kind of caring attention parents might show toward a child taking its first steps. They spoke of the challenges his species faced, the resistance patterns that typically emerged during consciousness transitions, the most effective ways to provide guidance without violating the fundamental principle of free will that governed all authentic spiritual evolution. Why is free will so important? Marcus asked. Sensing this was a crucial concept he needed to understand more fully, a being of pure geometric light responded, its communication arriving as mathematical equations that somehow translated directly into emotional understanding. Forced evolution is no evolution at all. Consciousness cannot be compelled to expand, only invited and supported. Each soul must choose its own pace of awakening, its own path of discovery. Our role is to provide information and opportunity, not to determine outcomes. Another entity, one that appeared to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, added its perspective. Love without freedom is possession. Growth without choice is programming. The consciousness that pervades all existence values authentic development over efficient compliance. This is why your species has been allowed to explore limitation, separation, and suffering, even when such explorations cause pain. The wisdom gained through direct experience cannot be acquired any other way. Marcus began to understand why his encounter felt so different from the alien abduction scenarios popularized in science fiction. This wasn't about subjugation or exploitation, but about invitation and empowerment. These beings weren't trying to control humanity, but to offer tools and perspectives that could help his species navigate its own evolutionary challenges more successfully. What happens when I return? Marcus asked, suddenly aware that his time in this expanded reality was drawing to a close. How do I integrate what I've learned? How do I share this information without being dismissed as delusional? His original guide reappeared beside him, its presence now feeling like that of a beloved teacher preparing a student for graduation. You will find that your perception has been permanently altered. You will see signs of awakening consciousness everywhere. Recognize fellow contactees through subtle signals. Attract opportunities to share your expanded understanding with those who are ready to receive it. But you must resist the temptation to convince or convert. Truth cannot be forced upon unwilling minds. Your role is to embody what you've learned, to live from the expanded awareness you've gained, and to trust that your authentic transformation will naturally inspire others who are ready for similar awakening. The council chamber began to fade around them as they returned through the vessel's organic corridors toward the portal that would return Marcus to his ranch. Yet he found that the boundaries between the craft's interior and the Montana landscape were becoming increasingly fluid, as if the experience of expanded consciousness had made such distinctions less relevant. "Remember," his guide said as they reached the threshold between worlds, "what you call God is not separate from what you call aliens, any more than the ocean is separate from the waves that express its movement. We are all expressions of the same infinite consciousness exploring itself through countless forms and experiences. The truth you've encountered tonight isn't foreign to your deepest nature, but the recognition of what you've always been beneath the layers of forgetting that characterize incarnation in physical reality." Marcus stepped through the portal and found himself standing once again in his familiar pasture, though nothing looked quite the same as it had before. The stars seemed closer and more alive, pulsing with intelligence and intention. The cattle, no longer frozen in supernatural stillness, moved naturally through their enclosure, though he could now sense the consciousness that animated each animal, the purpose that guided even their simple existence. The craft began to rise, its lights shifting through spectrums that painted the landscape in colors he'd never seen before. As it ascended, Marcus felt not abandonment but connection, an invisible thread of awareness that would permanently link him to the expanded reality he'd been shown. The humming faded gradually until only the familiar silence of rural Montana remained, though that silence now contained depths and possibilities he'd never imagined. Standing alone in his pasture, Marcus Chen realized that everything had changed and nothing had changed. He was still a rancher in Montana, still responsible for cattle and fences and the mundane details of physical existence. But he was also something infinitely more vast, a focal point of cosmic consciousness awakening to its own nature, a bridge between worlds that had always been connected beneath the surface of apparent separation. The questions that had driven him to seek solitude on this ranch had been answered, though not in ways he could have anticipated. God was indeed not what he had thought, but the reality was far more wonderful and intimate than any theology had suggested. He was not alone, had never been alone, would never be alone, because the consciousness that moved through him was the same consciousness that animated all existence across all dimensions of reality. As he walked back toward his house, Marcus understood that his real journey was just beginning. The following weeks passed in a haze of transformation that Marcus struggled to describe even to himself. Sleep became optional rather than necessary, his body sustained by energies he couldn't name, but could feel flowing through him like invisible rivers of light. Food tasted different, more alive somehow, as if he could perceive the consciousness within every grain and vegetable. The cattle seemed to recognize the change in him, approaching without fear, when previously they had maintained careful distance. But the most profound shift was in his perception of time itself. Moments would stretch into eternities of awareness, allowing him to witness the intricate dance of molecules in morning dew, the complex communications passing between trees through underground networks, the subtle harmonies created by planetary rotation. Other times, hours would compress into heartbeats as his consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of his physical form to touch distant stars and parallel dimensions. Marcus discovered he could no longer tolerate the news or social media. The constant stream of fear, division, and manufactured crisis felt like poison to his newly sensitized awareness. He understood now that these information systems weren't merely biased or inaccurate, but actively designed to maintain the illusion of separation that kept humanity trapped in cycles of conflict and scarcity. The beings had prepared him for this recognition, warning that awakened consciousness would naturally recoil from frequencies that served unconsciousness. Instead, he found himself drawn to older sources of wisdom. Books that had gathered dust on his shelves suddenly revealed layers of meaning he'd never perceived. Poetry became alive with hidden teachings. Scientific texts revealed spiritual truths their authors might not have consciously intended, and even simple children's stories contained profound insights about the nature of reality and consciousness. His dreams transformed completely. Rather than the random processing of daily experiences, sleep became a gateway to conscious communication with beings throughout the galaxy. Each night brought new encounters, expanded teachings, deeper integration of the truths he'd begun to discover. He learned that what humans called dreaming was actually one of the most natural forms of interdimensional communication, a capacity that had been systematically discouraged by cultures that benefited from keeping people trapped in purely physical awareness. The isolation that had once felt like punishment now revealed itself as preparation. Without the constant input of conventional social interaction, Marcus could hear the subtle communications flowing constantly through what the beings called the Universal Consciousness Network. Plants shared information about soil conditions and weather patterns. Animals coordinated their movements through telepathic signals. Even the rocks and minerals beneath his ranch participated in vast geological conversations that spanned continents and centuries. 3 weeks after his encounter, Marcus received his first human visitor since the transformation began. Sarah Martinez, his nearest neighbor living 15 miles down the valley, arrived unexpectedly one afternoon, claiming she'd felt an inexplicable urge to check on him. The moment she stepped out of her truck, Marcus could see the aura of confusion and seeking that surrounded her like a visible cloud. Sarah was a practical woman, a retired teacher who'd moved to Montana for the same reasons Marcus had chosen rural life. But something in her eyes suggested she was experiencing her own awakening, though she clearly lacked the framework to understand what was happening to her. As they sat on his porch sharing coffee, Marcus found himself carefully probing her recent experiences. "I've been having the strangest dreams," Sarah admitted, her voice carrying the hesitancy of someone sharing something they expected to be dismissed. Not normal dreams, but experiences that feel more real than waking life. "I'm visiting places that don't exist on Earth, talking with people who don't look entirely human but feel more familiar than my own family." Marcus felt the familiar tingle of recognition. Sarah was receiving her own form of contact, though perhaps more gradually than his dramatic encounter. He understood now that the beings approached each individual according to their capacity and circumstances, some through vivid physical encounters, others through dreams and subtle synchronicities, all designed to minimize trauma while maximizing genuine transformation. "Have you ever considered that these dreams might be more than your imagination?" Marcus asked carefully, remembering his guide's warning about not forcing understanding on unwilling minds. Sarah's eyes widened with relief rather than skepticism. "You don't think I'm losing my mind?" because honestly, these experiences feel more meaningful than anything I've encountered in my regular life. It's like I'm being educated about things I never knew I needed to learn, but desperately wanted to understand." Over the following hours, Marcus shared carefully selected aspects of his own experience, watching Sarah's face transform from confusion to recognition to profound gratitude. He realized this was how the awakening process was designed to unfold, not through mass media announcements or government disclosure, but through organic networks of individuals, each other's expansion ready to support into cosmic consciousness. Sarah left that evening carrying books Marcus recommended, and a sense of validation that her experiences were part of something larger and more purposeful than she'd dared hope. More importantly, she left knowing she wasn't alone in her journey toward expanded awareness, that others were navigating similar transformations and discoveries. The pattern repeated itself over the following months. People began appearing at Marcus's ranch with increasing frequency, drawn by impulses they yenily explain but felt compelled to follow. A young veterinarian experiencing spontaneous healings that defied medical explanation. An aerospace engineer whose calculations had begun revealing mathematical relationships that suggested consciousness was fundamental to physical reality. A former military pilot whose encounters with unidentified craft had shattered his materialist worldview. Each visitor carried pieces of a vast puzzle that was slowly revealing itself across human society. Scientists were discovering that observation literally created reality at quantum levels. Artists were channeling works of unprecedented beauty from sources beyond their personal imagination. Healers were accessing abilities that operated outside known biological mechanisms. Children were being born with capacities that previous generations couldn't even conceptualize. Marcus began to understand that his encounter hadn't been an isolated event, but part of a carefully orchestrated awakening process affecting millions of individuals worldwide. The beings weren't making random contact, but were systematically preparing humanity for the consciousness convergence they'd described, seeding awakened individuals throughout every culture and profession to serve as bridges between old and new paradigms. His ranch became an unofficial gathering place for what he privately called the awakening community. People they couldn't ask would arrive carrying questions elsewhere, experiences they couldn't share with conventional family or friends, insights that didn't fit within any established framework. Marcus found himself serving as a translator between expanded awareness and practical implementation, helping others integrate cosmic consciousness into daily human existence. The conversations that took place around his kitchen table would have sounded like science fiction to outside observers, but Marcus could see the profound transformation occurring in each participant. Fears dissolved as people recognized their eternal nature. Loneliness vanished when individuals realized their fundamental interconnection with all existence. Depression lifted as seekers discovered their unique roles in cosmic evolution, but the changes weren't purely internal. The awakened community began demonstrating abilities that challenged every assumption about human limitation. Spontaneous healings became commonplace as people learned to work with consciousness directly, rather than merely treating physical symptoms. Telepathic communication developed naturally as individuals released the belief that minds were separate and isolated. Precognitive awareness emerged as linear. Time revealed itself to be a temporary perspective rather than an absolute constraint. Marcus watched these developments with wonder and growing concern. The gap between awakened and conventional consciousness was widening rapidly, creating the potential for misunderstanding and conflict that could derail the entire transformation process. The beings had warned him about this possibility, explaining that consciousness convergence typically triggered resistance from established power structures that depended on keeping populations limited and controllable. Signs of this resistance were already appearing. Government agencies were increasing surveillance of individuals reporting contact experiences. Religious institutions were denouncing expanded consciousness as demonic deception. Scientific establishments were dismissing evidence that contradicted materialist assumptions. Media corporations were systematically ridiculing anyone who spoke publicly about awakening phenomena. Yet the awakening continued accelerating. For every individual intimidated into silence, 10 more began having their own expansion experiences. For every attempt to suppress information about consciousness and contact, 100 new sources of authentic teaching emerged. The universe itself seemed to be supporting the transformation process, creating synchronicities and opportunities that allowed truth to spread despite organized opposition. Marcus realized he was witnessing the birth pangs of a new phase of human evolution, a transition as significant as the development of language or the discovery of fire. But unlike previous evolutionary leaps that had occurred gradually over millennia, this transformation was happening within a single generation, compressed into a time frame that created both unprecedented opportunity and extraordinary instability. The beings continued communicating with him regularly, though no longer through physical visitation. Instead, they had taught him to access the consciousness network directly, allowing instantaneous communication across any distance or dimensional barrier. Through these exchanges, Marcus learned that similar awakening processes were occurring simultaneously on hundreds of worlds throughout the galaxy, each species navigating its unique version of consciousness convergence according to its particular history and characteristics. He discovered that the universe was far more alive and intentional than even his expanded awareness had initially grasped. Entire galaxies served as educational environments where consciousness explored increasingly complex forms of expression and experience. Solar systems functioned as classrooms where souls learned specific lessons about love, creativity, wisdom, and service. Planets provided laboratories where various species experimented with different approaches to collective evolution and cosmic citizenship. Earth's role in this vast educational system was becoming clearer. Humanity had been chosen to explore the extreme edges of separation consciousness, to discover what could be learned by forgetting divine connection so completely that rediscovering it would generate unprecedented depths of appreciation and understanding. The suffering and conflict that characterized human history weren't mistakes or punishments, but carefully designed experiences that would ultimately produce wisdom unavailable through any other means. But the experiment was reaching its conclusion. Humanity had learned all that separation consciousness could teach, and was ready to graduate into unity awareness. The choice now was whether this transition would occur smoothly through conscious cooperation or chaotically through continued resistance to expanded understanding. The outcome would affect not only Earth, but the entire galactic community that had invested eons of patient guidance in humanity's development. Marcus felt the weight of this cosmic responsibility settling around him and the growing awakening community. They weren't just individuals having interesting spiritual experiences, but conscious participants in a universal transformation process that would determine the future of consciousness itself in this region of space and time. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the window of opportunity wouldn't remain open indefinitely. As autumn arrived in Montana, Marcus stood once again in the pasture where his world had changed forever. The stars looked different now, not distant lights but nearby neighbors, fellow travelers on an infinite journey of discovery and growth. He could feel the presence of awakened beings throughout the galaxy, their combined consciousness focused on supporting humanity through its greatest evolutionary challenge. The transformation was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or predict. Within months, perhaps weeks, the awakening process would reach critical mass, triggering changes that would be visible to even the most unconscious observers. Humanity would either embrace its cosmic destiny or face the consequences of refusing to evolve beyond the limitations that no longer served its highest purpose. Marcus smiled, feeling profound gratitude for the role he'd been given in this magnificent unfolding. Whatever happened next, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be, serving purposes far greater than his individual existence, while simultaneously discovering that his individual existence was far greater than he'd ever imagined possible. The real adventure was just beginning, and every human being on Earth was about to discover what they were truly capable of becoming. Marcus's story challenges everything we think we know about contact, consciousness, and the nature of divinity itself. What began as a simple encounter in a Montana pasture revealed a truth so profound it redefines humanity's entire understanding of its place in the cosmic community. The being's message wasn't just about God being different than we imagined, but about recognizing that we ourselves are far more than we've ever dared to believe. The awakening Marcus experienced isn't unique to him. Right now, across the globe, thousands of individuals are having similar encounters, receiving similar revelations, preparing for a transformation that will either elevate our species to cosmic citizenship or leave us trapped in cycles of limitation and conflict. The choice isn't being made by governments or institutions, but by ordinary people like Marcus, like you, who must decide whether to embrace expanded consciousness or remain locked in old paradigms. The most remarkable aspect of this story isn't the alien encounter itself, but the recognition that such contact has been occurring throughout human history. Every prophet, every mystic, every individual who claimed direct communication with the divine may have been experiencing exactly what Marcus experienced that night in Montana. The difference now is that humanity has reached a collective threshold where these individual awakenings are beginning to create species-wide transformation. If you've felt drawn to this story, if something within you recognizes the truth in Marcus's experience, it might be because your own awakening is closer than you realize. The signs are everywhere for those ready to see them. The question isn't whether this transformation is real, but whether you're prepared to participate in the most significant evolutionary leap in human history. What do you think? Have you experienced your own moments of expanded awareness? Have you felt the presence of something greater trying to communicate with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your story might be the catalyst someone else needs to begin their own journey toward cosmic consciousness.